Please welcome Daniel Disalvo.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that generous welcome. Thank you, all of you, for coming out on such a beautiful and classic Colorado Boulder day. It seems sunny and snow covered. It's a real treat to be here. So I'm just going to jump into my presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions from there. I mean, I think where I want to start is broadly, and that's thinking about local democracy. And since this is the study for Western civilization, we should cast the net even broader in thinking about one of the greatest analysts, both of American democracy and of democracy in general, which is Alexis de Tocqueville. And Tocqueville was a great admirer of American local democracy, and that wasn't just the famous parts of democracy in America about the New England town halls, but he really said, look, local assemblies of the people constitute the strength of free nations. Municipal institutions are to liberty what primary schools are to science. They bring it within the people's reach, and they teach them how to use and enjoy it. So in some sense, Tocqueville's sweeping statement here gets us to think about the importance of local government for the vigor and health of democracy. And turning then to an American source and thinking about the structure and character of local governments in the United States, it's important to just recall that local governments are really the governments that are doing so many of the bedrock functions of what we think about as government, which is to say schooling, road building, policing, which I'm going to talk a lot more about obviously today. And even going back, Woodrow Wilson, when he was a political scientist, before he was president of Princeton and governor of New Jersey and then president, Wilson said, look, our local areas are not governed. They act for themselves. They have the large freedom of action and broad scope of function given to local authorities is the distinguishing characteristic of the American system of government. Most people would say, oh, separation of powers, federalism. They would point to these things. But local governments having this freedom and autonomy, that's the distinguishing characteristic. We don't quite think about it in that way. But if you compare American government to other democracies around the world, you see that American local government is really distinctive, and local governments, there's a huge amount of variation in what they do, how they do it, the amount of functions that they perform, from very small villages that perform only a few functions to municipal governments like in my hometown of New York City that are almost like quasi-state governments, or even comparable in some ways to national governments elsewhere. So this huge range is so important. And I think you can think about it too if you think about the number of people employed by local governments, which is about 14 million people are employed by local governments in the United States versus only about 3 million for the federal government. So the local governments are just, that's really where government is, the rubber's meeting the road. And of course, we're all much more likely to interact with any local government and local government official than we ever are likely to interact with federal officials. So, well, when it comes to political scientists and people in my field, I'm in a way going to caricature things to simplify them. But one view of local politics in the United States is that it's really different from national politics. It's different because the issues are different. It's different because there are questions that are just not on the national political agenda, right? Or this was the traditional view. Local government is doing different things. It's got to have issues about, are you going to allow food trucks? And where can the food trucks park? That could be a local political issue. Does that divide neatly along ideological lines between conservatives and liberals, between Democrats and Republicans? I don't know that there's a strong ideological position on your food truck policy, right? In that sense, local government would be distinct from national politics, right? The issues it dealt with were different. They didn't match up with partisan and ideological categories that we apply to the analysis of the national government. In another view, and this is really on the basis of much more recent scholarship, as a number of prominent political scientists have developed you could say, better measures of ideology and partisanship at the local level. And they say, well, in fact, it turns out that local government in this account is much more like national politics, in the sense that it matches up with its partisan and ideological, and that many cities are going to, in some sense, mirror the partisan ideological makeup of their inhabitants. Right. So in one view, local politics is really a different world. It's distinct. In another view, it's sort of the same. Now, then there's the issue of America's fraught racial politics. Obviously, especially the role of Black Americans in US, and especially Black Americans in urban centers. And here there's another entire branch of political science research that really looks at how America's racial politics is in some ways shaped from the bottom up, especially in municipal, especially in big city politics, and starting with local communities. And there, this bedrock function of local governments, policing, right? The United States, like, unlike France, has local and state police forces. There isn't a national police force. It's not, say, like France, where you have a national police force that operates in all jurisdictions. And here the argument is that the character of policing in particular, this bedrock function of local government, insofar as it interacts with minority communities, is really one of the main channels through which they're interacting with the state or with government. And that can go on to shape, in many respects, their view of democracy. And this could be true not simply for minority communities or Black communities in the United States, but for all communities. And in some sense, some of the research, my own research will say something or speaks a little bit to this question or issue of the perceptions of government, perceptions of the state. Now, if we get narrowing down a little further into tonight's topic, is policing politics. And policing has in some ways always been a perennial local issue in the United States, right? And it's a perennial political issue. Lots of candidates for office, especially in state and local government, are going to have, classic campaigns. They're going to be tough on crime, or they're going to be easier. And there will be campaigns on being easier on crime, but they're going to be more sympathetic. There's going to be criminal justice reform that's going to be easier on certain communities, perhaps. So this kind of debate, crime and policing, are perennial political issues. But they're not clearly partisan or ideological issues. When crime is, for example, debated in most campaigns, it's what political scientists call a valence issue, right? Nobody's saying I'm pro-crime, I'm against crime. That on one side or the other of the debate, one candidate or the other is trying to stake out a position as, say, tougher on crime than the other, but everybody's anti-crime. So in that sense, doesn't fit into a partisan or ideological issue. I'm for higher taxes or I'm for lower taxes. You don't get those kind of same divides. And crime and policing, in a way, cuts across that. If you think about Democrats, right, they're worried in many cases because Black Americans are a key part of their coalition. In particular, they're worried that crime and policing can have negative impacts on a key part of their coalition. So they don't want to be too strongly, pro-police, but they don't want to be seen as you could say, as too favorable to crime or criminals. Republicans, of course, have been traditionally the party of law and order. But if you think about this, they're going to be skeptical of police unions, and that's going to be a topic I'm going to dive down into a little bit deeper. Democrats, of course, often much more favorable to organized labor, again, a key part of their coalition. So you can see some of these cross pressures that policing, organized labor, local politics create. And now today, I should say, in the wake of the recent controversial police killings of Black Americans, this has become a national issue. So this has added a new compounding factor. What was a perennially local issue has now become much more part of national politics, even though, as we see the bills in Congress struggle to make their way through, it's partly because the federal government, it's a local issue in our federal system, and there's just not that much that the federal government can do. It's not something they have clear jurisdiction over. So again, this policing is this central domestic policy issue in the United States. Right? It's one with local governments are the primary authority. But the truth is political scientists are catching up here. Right? Local governments in general have not been at the forefront of political science research for the last 30 years. Local governments, so you could think back to, there was a whole great generation of political scientists that really, you could say, starting with Robert Dahl, a very famous political scientist, that cut their teeth in local politics, made their name. Dahl became famous for a study of New Haven, of all places. But local politics in particular, city politics, urban politics, was shunted aside for much more interest in national politics, especially national institutions, probably most centrally Congress and the presidency. And then we have police unions, also a relatively new phenomenon in American political life. Government unions did not really get their start until the late 60s and 70s and really hadn't, you could say, taken firm root until the 1980s. So we've only really had, if I want to shorten the time horizon a little bit, about 40 years of unionized state and local government with this job category of police included in that. And they're important interest groups. They do lots of things I'll talk about, donate to campaigns, endorse candidates. Lots of politicking is done by public employee unions, whether they represent teachers or police officers or other civil servants. But interest groups also in political science have not been really at the forefront of political science research. In part, I'll go into that for people that are concerned or interested in that question of why that's the case. Interest groups were, again, central to political science 30 or 40 years ago, but have really kind of fallen off the main agenda of what's, you could say, the leading scholarship of the discipline. Although I should say that's been changing in the last 5 to 10 years as a number of prominent scholars have sought ways to bring interest groups back. And the way they've done it actually is by looking more at state and local politics rather than the national government. In part, the problem with interest group research at the national level is Washington is just a big crowded space, and it's very hard for political scientists methodologically to detect interest group influence. But if you get the comparative leverage of looking at state government, 50 states and thousands of local governments, you get a little bit more of an opportunity to, say, tease out what might be the influence of interest groups. So now I just want to say a couple words about police unions in particular. Police are actually the most heavily unionized segment of the public sector workforce in the United States, surpassing even K through 12 teachers, which is probably running a close second. They're also the second largest employment category in the United States, again, after K-12 schooling, which is far and away the largest category of government employees in the country. So there's about roughly speaking, this is data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Roughly 700,000 police officers are covered in the United States, are covered by union contracts, right? Not all police officers are members of unions, but they can still be covered by union contracts, even if they're not members. And you can see it's a very close number, about 55% are union members. Then you have other category of not just officers, but supervisors and detectives. Again, a slightly more elite level of people inside police departments. Again, the unionization rate is slightly lower there, but about 40%. And I should say that, compared to the private sector, these numbers are much higher, right? Private sector unionization rates today is about 6% of the private sector labor force, right? Again, it's important to keep in mind that public employment is only about 20% of the total labor force in the United States. So, I'm making an estimate, but roughly there's about 120 million full-time workers in the United States, and only about a little more than 20 million of those are public employees. The rest are all private sector employees. So private sector unions have had a long and fairly steep decline since the 1950s to today. So a couple of the assumptions that, as I get into this, my work on police unions as interest groups, is I just kind of assume, and I think there's data, that police unions are active in city politics, but they're not active on every single issue, right? They're interest groups that are not all-purpose groups, so not like something like Common Cause that's going to take policy positions on a whole range of issues that you'd see at the national level. They're really going to take political stands and take an interest in things that matter to police officers in a much narrower and sharper sense, right? So that's, I think, an important distinction, because if we think about, if we're trying to look for influence of police unions, we don't want to look at it for across all kinds of things in local government, but on very narrow and targeted things that they care about. And we know that collective bargaining agreements, so one channel that police unions could be said to have influence, is through collective bargaining agreements. Now, typically state laws provide for a collective bargaining process, which is usually what also impacts the unionization rate in a given state. So a collective bargaining agreement basically is three aspects to it. It sets pay, some benefit levels, although I should say public pensions are not typically bargained. So it's usually healthcare, and work rules. And that third part, that's going to be in a typical contract. The union will have its lawyers, and they'll meet with the management side lawyers representing the local government. And these agreements then apportion power between labor and management, and really they shape the way policing is done, or they shape the organizational culture of police departments. Especially, for example, the work rules provisions are going to, in some ways, set out in advance a whole series of steps for any time a chief or a supervisor wants to transfer, fire, discipline, or do anything else to an officer. That a whole series of detailed steps have to be followed, right? If there are complaints against officers by civilians, how those complaints are handled can often be stipulated in the collective bargaining agreement, right? So management may come in, officers, history of complaints against them, right? Whether those complaints were sustained or dismissed, whether those can be seen by chiefs, after how long, all of that can be covered in collective bargaining agreements. So they're very important for setting up the organizational structure of a police department. Now, the unions themselves, coming out of which form to represent police officers, we know that they do things like endorse candidates for office, and their endorsements are often sought by local officials, for mayor, for city council. They donate to their campaigns, provide contributions to campaigns, and we know they lobby elected officials. So those are these three other channels. So you have this one way, this legally required way to have a contract, usually every 3 to 5 years, a contract is going to be renegotiated. That gives police union officials one path of influence. And then in the interim, between any period of negotiation, you have a political channel, right? And some people call this, or I've called it, I guess, getting 2 bites at the apple. Unlike other interest groups, if you think about in American political life, they're really only able to do the second one. They don't get this legally required access to government officials to say what they want in a collective bargaining process, right? So they get 2 chances. They can't win in collective bargaining, maybe they can win through politics, or vice versa. Now, I just drawn a friend of mine who's done an interesting big survey data of local officials. So she surveyed local city officials, mayors, and city council members around the country, and just asked them this is with only cities with more than 50,000 people. And she just asked, well, who's active in local politics? Not whether they have any influence or anything, but just who, what groups do you see as active in local politics? And you can see police unions, firefighters unions, chambers of commerce, developers, those are outpacing pretty much all the other groups. Now, people might say, well, why are the teachers' unions so low? Again, remember, this is a survey of mayors and city council members. And with only a few exceptions, Teachers unions are more interested in school districts, right? School districts are separate governments. So again, the local government is actually, in this case, the city government is not going to be controlling what's of interest to teachers unions. Yeah.
Do you have a lens on why firefighters unions are so active? That seems kind of surprising.
I guess it shouldn't be surprising, actually. They're in it for the same reasons as police unions, right? What are they? Again, they're interested in narrow issues of doing things for their members, right? Their issues in health and safety things. So most immediately, what are most unions interested in? Improving the benefits, pay, and working conditions for their members. And you can think about how that could impact, schedules for firefighters, how often, when they have to be in the firehouse, their retirement packages. It could also impact building codes, right? Firefighters have an interest. So firefighters may sometimes line up with chambers of commerce and developers and be part of important coalitions supporting or opposing development because they're interested in, well, this could put our people at risk in the future, so we're interested in that. So all those same kind of incentives would be there for firefighters as well. Firefighters, just as a slight aside, are often much more popular politically. Police, just by the nature of their job, have an adversarial relationship with the communities that they serve, whereas on the other hand, everybody loves firefighters. So in a sense, firefighters tend to be a little bit more politically popular than police. Now, this gets a little bit theoretical, but again, if we're thinking about political influence of police unions or of really any interest group, a really important theoretical contribution to the study of influence in general in political science is this classic theory about the two faces of power, right? The first view is, well, and I have the Roman god of Janus, the two faces. So one you can see better, one you can see less well. The first face, if we're looking for political influence, people say, well, I can see this group is influential because they're donating a lot of money to campaigns, because they are lobbying, right? And we can track and measure spending on lobbying, right? We can interview state and local officials, and if they say, yes, those groups are active, I see those people, they're here on the steps of the State House, they're protesting, they're doing all kinds of things that are visible. But the trouble is that it's the second face of power that's really hard to get at or measure, and we always should keep that in mind when we're trying to assess influence, which is a group might be powerful even if it's not doing much of anything, because it just sets the terms of debate that you can't see, that in some sense, it keeps things off the agenda. People don't even propose it because they say, if we do, we know this group will come out against it, right? There's a lot of theorizing about this, for example, about teachers unions, for example. Many people who are in favor of charter schools will say, well, we don't even want to propose increasing the charter cap in this legislative cycle in New York because we know, I'm parochial, a lot of my examples are from New York. We know that the AFT, which is the main teachers union, will go tooth and nail against us, so we don't even bring it up, right? To the extent that something like that happens, we as social scientists can never measure that second face of power, right? So we always want to keep in mind that even if we can see these visible manifestations that police unions, for example, might be influential, we always have to keep in mind, well, they might be even more influential than what we can see, because there's the second face of power where different proposals aren't even brought up because people could see that they're going to oppose them, they're not going to get any traction. So again, I'm proposing the city police unions are going to be active in city politics. They're going to be active on issues important to them. And I switched a little bit the effect of this, not to so much look at outputs of local government policies. I'll talk a little bit about the existing research on this, but in what I want to present to you tonight is something a little bit more downstream, the potential effect. So the outcome I want to look at is public perceptions of the police themselves, right? Does their political activity yield different public perceptions? Not so much does it change policies, does it change work rules, does it change pay scales? There's interesting research here, but the twist I want to give you tonight is to look at the potential influence of police unions insofar as they're active in local governments on what that means for what people think about the police in big urban centers, right? And a big question related to this, has been, of course, police violence, right? The most recent, I just put up the most recent instance of this, the Tyree Nichols killing in Memphis, right? We've got about 1,000 civilians killed each year by police. I should say most of them, and I'll show some data in a second, are armed. But some allege too that police unions are specifically to blame for increased violence against civilians, right? Because, and especially Black Americans, because, and I'll go into some of the reasons why they give a sense of impunity to the police because they have so many job protections that they won't be disciplined or fired. So maybe not even killing, but roughing people up, police beatings and so on. So this is just, you've probably seen this as just the data. The Washington Post began a database tracking police killings of civilians, and there's some other data sets on police violence. Again, we don't have great data on this, but if you look, since 2015, this goes up only to 2020, about a little over 5,000 people were killed at the hands of the police, but 94% were armed. So it's important to always to keep that in mind. The number of these really controversial cases, such as George Floyd, is a relatively small number inside our very large and diverse country. And it is true that Black Americans, as their relative to their portion in the population, have suffered more at this than others, although the total numbers are bigger for whites because there's more white. So when we think about these outcomes of what people think police unions are affecting, right? There's just not that much research out there. This is really a research agenda in the social scientists, some economists, some political scientists, that is really just getting off the ground. And what have people found? There is some evidence, again, I should caution, 2 or 3 good academic papers that have found that unionization of police does increase violence against civilians. It might increase killings. There's one paper that finds that. There's one that it does increase other forms of aggression against the police, using some evidence from Florida. But there's also another important paper that finds that there's been unionizing your police department has no effect on the police violence against civilians. So I think this relationship is still unresolved as far as good social science is concerned. I think there's more evidence that collective bargaining, once collective bargaining was introduced for police, does increase local spending on law enforcement, usually in the form of higher pay and typically higher benefit levels, better medical plans that cover more, and even higher pensions, which is slightly a separate issue. So having police unions and collective bargaining, you're going to pay more for your police, whether you're getting better policing for the money, that remains unresolved, but you're certainly going to pay more where it's in effect. And there's one study just looking at the way police unions can block things that they disagree with that finds that it decreases the likelihood that police will be required to wear body cameras. So in jurisdictions with unions, less likelihood, and then even the rules of, think about this gets very technical in a hurry, when you have to turn your camera on, under what conditions, all of that can be part of a collective bargaining contract, even in the case where you have a unionized jurisdiction and body cameras are permitted or required perhaps by state law, but then the nitty-gritty can be ironed out in collective bargaining. So turning to my own work here, and what the kind of conclusions I want to share with you is an economist colleague and I collaborated on this little project, and we tried to estimate the effect of police unions on trust in the police in US cities. My economist colleague, I should say, is He's terrific. Most of his work is on social capital and social trust and how it impacts lots of usually economic outcomes of business growth and so on. So this was my interest in public employee unions, his interest in social trust. This was a way to collaborate. And so we looked at how the strength or weakness, right, measured in different ways, but typically the percentage of police officers belonging to a union in a given jurisdiction impacts public perception of the police. There was a lot of, say, discussion after the George Floyd killing saying, well, in places where police unions reduce trust in the police, and there's a large number of news articles with statements of this kind, and that sparked my interest in the topic. And I said, is that true? Does that happen? Or could it go the other way? So again, we don't go into in our study some of these impacts like on costs or on the behavior of officers that other research has done. So we're interested in this outcome of trust in the police. And we know trust is a super important variable in the social sciences, economists, political scientists. There's lots and lots of philosophers have all done a lot of interesting work on trust over the years, and it's related to economic growth, public health, mental health, good governance. All of these outcomes can be seen to be impacted by the level of trust in society. And in particular, people are very interested in trust in government, in especially order institutions, police and courts. And really that's in some sense gets to that thing about the legitimacy of the state's actions. You could see that as the sharp edge of where trust really meets up with our perceptions of the state and state power and whether it's legitimate, right? Is focusing on these order institutions. Now, this is just survey data from Gallup going back to the 90s, and you can see our current political environment, a uptick in the number of people saying they trust the police only some and have public confidence in the questions. Wording is important. In the police has dropped over the last 5 years or more, really since the Floyd killing. So this is important. This is a general national survey data. But if you think about police unions' effect on trust, what's most interested my colleague and I, it's really ambiguous. And so the reason we were interested in this topic is, well, police unionizing your police could increase trust, right? Unions are effective advocates on behalf of officers, even on behalf of bad officers. In fact, they have a legal duty to be so, right? And they can tell the cops' side of the story. So they're going to get on TV. You're going to often see and say, our officer, he was under threat. He was attacked. He was in the right, defending himself when he or she use their nightstick on this person, right? They're going to get out there and make those claims. I, of course, have a picture of, I should say, Pat Lynch. Many of you from New York, and as I said, we're parochial in New York. We think New York is the center of the world, which it is, of course. And so everyone should know Pat Lynch. He is the head of the PBA of New York City police officers. He's a classic Irish police officer who lives on Long Island. He's right out of Central Casting. He talks very loud, but he's a persistent advocate on behalf of New York City police officers. So maybe Lynch, at least with some people, him getting out and in the press and in the media and on stage with the mayor does increase trust in the police, right? Because it's somebody out there is going to be their advocate. On the other hand, you could say, well, police unions could reduce trust, right? Union contracts that protect bad officers, right? It's been found in a number of studies that a lot of the civilian complaints against officers are concentrated on a very small portion of officers. But union contracts that have all of those work rules and disciplinary procedures that I mentioned make it very difficult to fire, transfer, or discipline those officers, right? The Tyree Nichols case is so interesting. The officers were immediately fired and charged with murder, which is different than the usual case, right? Officers, you can go to arbitration, you can be reinstated. right? So there's a lot of steps to getting rid, to firing an officer. So this could shield bad conduct, and that bad conduct gives the police a bad reputation in the community, and trust would fall. So does unionization increase or decrease trust? So we tried to test this with some data. What we found was that collective bargaining, and which is to say unionization, does not significantly directly impact trust in the police in the cities. I'll show you the cities that we studied, right? It doesn't move it up or down. What we did find that I think is very interesting is what we call a buffering effect. That is to say, after there's a police killing of a civilian, trust declines across all groups. But where they have collective bargaining rights, trust comes back up much more quickly, right? It doesn't fall as far and it comes back up, right? So if you have this buffering effect that in a sense, you could say collective bargaining rights restores trust in the police after a controversial killing, much quicker than in jurisdictions without police unions. So perhaps that activity of people like Patrick Lynch getting out and saying something is going to restore confidence in the police faster. Whether that confidence is merited is not something that we look at, right? It could be that the police really were in the wrong and they're being defended in a way they don't deserve, right? Now, I should say our analysis and findings have an important racial subtext, right? Which is the attitudes towards the police. This has long history in political science, have often been polarized along racial lines, which is to say Black Americans distrust the police much more than whites, right? Or whites and even Latinos, right? And we find this in our own results, right? The survey data that we use. Now, the reasons for this are long and historic, obviously not the subject of our research, but widespread reports by Black Americans of various forms of adverse effect of stopping and frisk at higher rates, traffic stops that are not experienced by whites. So there's this deeper distrust. So the one interesting thing we find is that unionization is not significantly affected, doesn't affect Black trust really at all, and neither does the number of fatal encounters with the police, interestingly. Whereas when there's a fatal encounter with the police, meaning the police kill someone in a local jurisdiction, trust among whites, Latinos, Asians, all other groups falls. Black trust stays the same, right? It doesn't move. It starts out lower, but it doesn't change. And we kind of interpret this as an I told you so effect, meaning they distrusted the police already. Here's a controversial incident or controversial killing. We were telling you that not to trust the police, and this is what happened, right? So Black trust doesn't move. Now, we really hypothesize that there's two ways that collective bargaining rights impact trust in the police in the wake of fatal encounters between the police and civilians, right? One is police unions, leaders, not to pick on Patrick Lynch, but like Patrick Lynch, mount a public defense of the officers involved. Second, and this goes to that second face of power that I mentioned, police unions have ties with local elected officials. And it may be that those local elected officials, we could say, pull their punches. They're not as critical of police in public as they might otherwise be. Or maybe they even remain silent, say, well, we got to let the investigation play out. We're not going to say, take a public stand on this one way or the other. That alters the public discourse. We hypothesize that we can't observe whether that happens. We can observe only the first face of power, the lobbying, the campaign contributions, all of that. We can't say whether that second thing really happens, but it's a hypothesis. And we sort of, again, I did this with an economist, so we had to have some economic theory too, which is that we use some literature from marketing, which is that police unions are really involved in a customer relationship management for the police. They kind of shore up customer commitment. You should buy into the police are doing a good job. That's sort of the role of police unions, right? And therefore, really, when police unions are out after a controversial killing, they're not appealing to everyone. In fact, they're probably not even appealing to many Black Americans who already distrust them at high levels, right? They're really aimed at targeting probably mostly whites and some portion of the Latino community to shore up and bring back trust in them, right? That's because there's, in some sense, their views are more elastic. I'll run through this really quickly because I'm running short on time. How did we, I gave you all these findings, but I didn't tell you how we got there. We used individual level trust data from a Harvard social capital survey that was conducted by Robert Putnam and his colleagues that ran and asked a specific question about, do you trust the police, for 5 years in the early 2000s. And then we were only able to use not all of the 22 cities in the sample, but I'll show you the cities we used. And we then matched that with 3 additional data sets, one on where fatal encounters, where and when have police killed civilians. A second one on in a way, use our control variables on city political ideology. And then we used a National Bureau of Economic Research data set on duty to bargain laws by state. So, you know, we use this duty to bargain law. Again, I won't go too deep into some of these methodological questions, but once a state adopts a collective bargaining law it's often for all employees, but often even in some cases just for police officers. So Texas, for example, allows its police officers to be unionized, but it doesn't allow collective bargaining for other categories of employees. But once you have a collective bargaining law in effect, that's what allows this collective action to happen for the union to be created. That increases union membership. It increases union dues, in turn makes the unions more politically potent. Which is why, you know, typically in right to work states in the South and Southwest, you have lower union membership, lower union revenues, and presumably less political power. The cities, or in our case, municipal statistical areas in our sample, again, weighted slightly to having a collective bargaining as a duty, but we had a pretty broad mix, some small cities, some bigger cities, a wide dispersion of geography. That there's more cities with collective bargaining than not tracks again with the fact that police are the most heavily unionized segment in society. So it's harder to find jurisdictions without duty to bargain for police. I'm going to skip over, we can come back to this. This is just some characteristics of our sample, but this gives you just a picture of our best fit. You can see the duty to bargain. You're going to see higher trust across all states. We did our analysis both for states and for the 11 cities. And you can see that you have much lower trust across the no duty to bargain. So let me just wrap up here. I want to get to your questions, and I've said a lot. So I think our key finding in our research has been that granting police collective bargaining prevents this drop in trust when fatal encounters occur, when police kill a civilian, right? Now, you could say that collective bargaining and unionization then serves to manage police community relations. Again, that's bracketing whether whether that's good or bad. It could be that it's bad because you're managing some pretty nasty things done by the police, or it could be good because it's, again, telling the police's side of the story. And in a sense, collective bargaining renders this broader public response equivalent to the null response of Black Americans. If you have collective bargaining, there's a fatal encounter, trust is going to come right back up, and it's like nothing happened, right? Whereas for Black Americans, their trust level's lower. It doesn't move when there's a fatal encounter. Now, what are our limitations of our study? The data don't come up to the present, and clearly the political landscape on this issue has shifted a lot, since the George Floyd killing and the protests and riots that it followed in its wake. We don't have a full sample, of all cities, which would be great, or even of all cities, all the 10 biggest cities or something like that. That would be great. But so there's some data limitations there as well. But I've hit my 45-minute mark, and so I'll leave it there and take your questions.
Thank you very much. Just as a reminder to the virtual audience, you can ask questions using the Q&A. Yes.
So, yeah, thanks for an interesting talk. I don't know if you're familiar with, was it Debbie and Fryer's work about viral incidents?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of any work, or have you and your colleagues thought about doing follow-up work looking at viral versus non-viral incidents? Because it seems like that's a particular class of police killing that has completely different trust dynamics. Like when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, there were calls to close the CU Boulder PD, right? Which is, I imagine that the ability of the union to manage that kind of a thing is just vastly different.
Vastly different. Yeah, I think, we cite the Debbie and Fryer article on this in our conclusion of the paper, basically to say the ability to manage public perceptions of the police in the viral incident world has gotten so much harder. Our big problem on the data side is we don't have trust data, right? We have the collective bargaining data coming up to now, but we don't have good trust data that we compare it with, let's say, post George Floyd, right? If we had better trust data that we could pare down to the individual level in cities, we could follow up and do that. But that's been our big constraint there. But I think that's a whole different thing, is how much can police unions manage these relationships when people can watch the video, right? And in some cases, the video can, if it's not clear, and you can see the Tyree Nichols thing, it's, there's some questions if one really watches, the disturbing video, why, there's clearly stuff happened. We don't see him being pulled out of the car, right? If you watch the video, there's a lot of stuff that might have happened on the front end that you can't see. But what happens in the video itself is so indefensible that, whereas you can imagine other police, even some of the videos that have come out, it's much harder to see, there would be material that you could imagine a police union leader capitalizing on and saying, well, see this part, you're not paying attention to that, but it's much harder in that environment. So the whole, even police unions, you could say as a political entity, prior to 2015, who was really thinking about this? They weren't widely covered in the media, maybe in some local politics and some particular scandals here and there, often in California. But the environment for them has changed, not just because of the viral videos, but because there's a lot more media attention to them in particular and what they say and what they do. So
So first, relatively minor concern, but was just curious if you controlled for the presence in the given states for a law enforcement officer Bill of Rights. And then at a slightly more structural level, I'm wondering, and granted you didn't present the full model with all of the controls and everything, surrounding reverse causality, which is, wouldn't you expect collective bargaining rights to emerge in places where the perception of police is stronger than in contexts where there's higher levels of skepticism ex ante?
Well, the first one is easy. We did not control for the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights there. Two plausible theoretical reasons for not doing so. One is, in many cases, even when you don't have a law enforcement Bill of Officers, Bill of Rights, what are law enforcement officers trying to get in the union contract? Exactly that, right? And insofar as we looked at the state level, in addition to looking at the municipalities, so we looked at all 50 states and then we looked at the municipalities, what we could see there is that, in a sense, takes into account the union political influence that would presumably have gone into getting the state to pass a law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights. So in a way, it's become so fine-grained at the end of the day that it would be hard to sort it out, because you have collective bargaining agreements that are almost, in some cases, word for word for a law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights. Tell me your second question again, which was
just reverse causality.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Which is the trust. You would expect trust to emerge, or you would expect the right to collectively bargain to emerge in higher trust contexts to begin with.
Yeah, well, we have a big time frame issue here, which is, again, most states adopted their collective bargaining laws in basically a very discrete time window in American history. You could say starting at the earliest with Wisconsin that adopted a statewide collective bargaining law for all public employees in 1958, and really kind of ends or comes to its conclusion with Illinois in 1983. So really over the course of that period is when state governments are adopting collective bargaining laws. And perhaps at that time, you're thinking about, well, maybe just, and some had just for specific categories of worker, not a generalized group. But there you could say that it's so entangled, the police are so entangled with all the other labor groups that are seeking to get collective bargaining rights, that it's not just whether you have confidence in the police or not, because we're going to pass a collective bargaining law that's going to apply to teachers and civil servants, right? There in my previous scholarship, so there we didn't try to control for that reverse causality. We're just starting from the point in 2000, because that's 2000 to 2007, which is our data series. We're just starting from who has it and who doesn't. But to dilate a little bit on this historical causal question, which is interesting, of which states and why did they adopt collective bargaining rights. In my previous work, I did try to explore that. I think the big issue there is many of the already strong union states were most inclined to adopt collective bargaining for public employees. Why by the late 50s was that a big agenda item for organized labor? One explanation is the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 over Truman's veto, which basically meant that organized labor was not going to be able to expand as the southern states immediately, immediately after the law or shortly thereafter, passed right to work laws, which meant that organized labor in the private sector was not going to be able to expand into the South and Southwest. Where could we move elsewhere? Well, move into the public sector, and we can gain members and money by organizing the public sector. So over the course of the 50s, that becomes an important pathway. So Taft-Hartley Act is one big source. The motivations of organized labor, the existing, you say, political preferences probably of the already unionized states. And third, I think a big factor in the drive for that is the decline of party machines in city government, right? Party machines that had controlled a lot of public employment. As those civil service rules really come into effect by the 1950s, finally pressing down to the municipal level, right? You don't have party machines that are going to be controlling patronage and jobs anymore. So what's a way to organize the political power of public employees in a new way? And elected officials say, well, hey, if we get them together and they have a union, well, that makes sense to us. And it gives us someone to negotiate with. So that's like, you can see Illinois as being at the tail end, right? 1983, what really had to happen before Illinois could pass a statewide collective bargaining law was the daily machine had to be substantially weakened in Chicago.
I have an ignorant but relevant question. Let me ask it now, so that anyone who's ignorant about this, because as it's settled. You hear a lot these days about there's a great controversy over a doctrine or the doctrine of qualified immunity for police.
Yep.
Is that a matter of state law, federal law? Is that collectively bargained? Is that relevant to what police unions are doing, or is that done by another branch?
It's certainly relevant to police unions and to their members, right? Qualified immunity.
They care about it.
They care about it.
Do they influence it, or is that separate?
Well, qualified immunity is interesting because it's in effect a judicial policy. It was something that was created out of a series of court decisions in the federal courts. So it's not a creation of Congress passing by a federal statute. And it's not something that's been collectively bargained. It's something that kind of emerged out of federal court decisions. So now the issue before Congress and many of these recent, proposals, whether this is, Tim Scott's bill from the Republican side in the Senate or the Democratic alternatives that want to do away with or modify qualified immunity, what they're really after is overturning the court's interpretation, right? So that's really saying, well, we're going to pass a new law that's going to revisit this, but it's not something that Congress itself did. So that's why that is one piece that you hear about persistently whenever there's a controversial police killing that becomes a national political issue, and Congress is, the public is sort of seemingly demanding that something be done. Because policing is a local issue, there just aren't that many levers that the federal government can pull. But okay, well, here's one thing: qualified immunity. But I mean, that would go into, if police officers were liable for this would create all kinds of new issues that the unions would want to bargain to protect their members. Right? I don't know. I could say more about that. Yeah.
So I wonder if there's like a boring explanation for some of this behavior, because collective bargaining seems like a kind of fun and kind of interesting way to kind of think about this, but it also seems like, I mean, you started your talk with kind of just the size of the number of people in the police sector, right, or in just the public employee sector, and so before they are signing collective bargaining agreements, they're also voters, right? And like the fact that they are organized in a union, I mean, I could see a reason why you'd want to do that independent of anything that you thought you might be able to give them, or that would make the bargaining easier, which is just that, like, you got a place where you can go to yell at them about how they should vote for you, right? And is that also a part of what we're seeing, is that like politicians like just care about these people as voters, and that affects some of the dynamics of trust and how they treat them, like whether they are doing it like with the union, they're also just talking to the voters, right?
That's certainly true. And you could say that public employees are an important political force insofar as public employees are spread throughout every jurisdiction, every district in the entire nation. So that's going to be one way that you're going to turn, if you're turning out your members. Now, one branch of political science research on unions, whether it's public sector unions or private sector unions, is that the unionizing itself has an independent effect on member turnout to vote, which is to say, the classic studies here, and even really good new recent work on teachers unions by my colleague Michael Hartney at Boston College, in his new book, has terrific new analysis that once teachers gained collective bargaining rights, what happened to teacher voter turnout? It increases by about 6 percentage points, right? And this was always a classic area of scholarship for private sector unions, right? If you're thinking, if you're representing blue collar workers, my grandfather worked in steel mills in Pittsburgh, right? Didn't have a formal education beyond age 11, right? Those people would be less likely to turn out. They have lower levels of education, lower levels of income, right? Unionizing them was a force for increasing voter turnout for especially people with low SES status, right? And you can see, many police officers, high schools, their terminal educational achievement. So unionizing them, which creates channels of communication, newsletters, all this kind of thing, spurs and increases voter turnout. So it's just one more element adding to that. So I think you're onto something with that.
I'm a bit puzzled. If you take a look at the unions versus non-unions, and you take a look at the benefits, health, salary, etc., and I have a follow-up question. Is there a difference? Is there a delta between the union and non-union police officer, what they receive, health benefits, salary, vacation?
Well, yes, that went back to some of the research I tried to summarize of saying that once you have a unionized jurisdiction, you're going to pay more for policing, and that paying more usually occurs in a few percentage points increase in salary, and typically a substantial increase in health benefits. So that's going to, so if you're in a unionized police officer, you're going to have basically, probably, I think I'm remembering the study I like the best, has 3 to 4 percentage points greater salary, right? Which doesn't sound like a lot, but spread across every police officer's salary, it starts to add up, and probably 8 to 9% more spending on their health benefits. So you are going to see a better package of pay on just those, say, material items of health and benefits. I mean, think one thing to think about with police that's different from so many other job categories, and perhaps this is, I let you get your follow-up, but it's, think about just in sociological terms, the career trajectory of a police officer, right? They probably have a high school degree, perhaps an associate's degree from a community college, but being a police officer is really a ticket into the middle class. But you're not going to be a police officer for that long. It's often, it's basically a 20-year career, and then you can qualify for a full pension at that point. So it's often seen as up and out, right? And the threats for police officers, the reason they care so much about so many of the work rules and job protections is because if they were to say, if you're a 35-year-old police officer and you get in a dispute with someone and something happens, a controversial incident, and you're fired, you're very much at risk of being kicked out of the middle class because you haven't developed a set of concrete skills that are transferable to another, realm of employment, right? Which is why that job security becomes so important, because your middle class status could almost be on the line. But yeah.
Have you thought about measuring the loyalty of the police to the community, or the police officers to the community? I have a reason for asking that.
I have not done that. I've never thought of that. It's a great question. I would imagine, but I don't know, that there's probably more when we're looking kind of inside the police department and police officers' attitudes themselves. I'm imagining that there's a literature on that question in criminology, right? And there's a whole branch of just kind of police studies in criminology, but I confess I am not familiar with that scholarship.
My hypothesis to be tested would be that if there was a stronger loyalty of the police force to the community, in all likelihood came from the community. And if they did come from the community, I'm wondering if there's a lower violence rate of interaction with the community if you have come from the community and loyal to the community. That's just a hypothesis.
Well, now that you put it that way, I can think of one line of both political debate that tracks with that and some scholarship on this question, which was whether you should have residency requirements for police officers, whether they should be required to reside in the jurisdiction that they're going to police, right? Which has been a big issue, let's say, again, parochial in New York. Can all the police live on Long Island, right? Or do they have to live in New York City, and would that change? I'm not deeply familiar with this. There have been some scholarly studies on residency requirements, like does it reduce violence or does it affect other outcomes? My sense, and again, I say this with a grain of salt because this isn't exactly my area. My sense is, from what I know of that literature, the answer is no, it doesn't really change many of the outcomes we would expect, right? It doesn't reduce violence of police officers.
Residency doesn't suggest loyalty.
Yeah, it's the closest proxy I could think of, but yeah.
I know that your data only goes through 2015, and you noted that the data you're using here. Have you seen data? I mean, a lot's happened since 2000. A lot of relevant stuff has happened since 2015. Whatever you want to call successor ideology, the Great Awakening, and then George Floyd. Lots of things, the defund the police movement. Just on the broadest issue concerning trust in the police. Have you seen data on how things have changed since 2015? Has there been a precipitous drop across the board in trust of police, or?
Well, I showed you the national, what we have on that score is, like the Gallup national survey data that I showed, which is just a national survey that tracks public confidence in institutions. Now, political scientists who are public opinion researchers, you could, in the data I showed, you do see a drop 2015 to now in people that are very confident in the police. Much of that, what's interesting is if you bore down into that data and did a sort of more rigorous analysis of it, it's interesting if you look at it and you sort the data by party. I just did this a little bit. Again, this is not rigorous social science. I was just curious. But if you sort that data by party, all the drop is actually on the Republican side. Right. Democrats' trust in the police, public confidence in the police hasn't gone down much according to the Gallup survey, but a portion of Republican trust in the police has actually declined, which is, I don't have a good explanation of that because it would seem curious since many of the defund the police efforts were coming from the left of the political spectrum, which one could have imagined would have sort of reinforced Republicans' vigor in protecting the police, but perhaps this is bound up with, January 6th or other images of law and order that are different. So a lot has happened, and I wish I could give you a better.
There's one other question I had about,
Yeah.
about that graph or those graphs. And that was, you noted very interesting result that in the wake of police killing or police violence, I forget
Yeah.
exactly what it was.
Killing.
Yeah. That trust in the police goes down across racial and ethnic groups, except amongst Blacks.
Yeah.
Where it stays the same, and you labeled it the sort of "we told you so"
Yeah.
effect. So what I was curious about is whether that level that stays stable is above or below the plunge from other groups.
The plunge in the other groups does not get them as low as Black trust in the police. So you can imagine Black trust in the police is going along like this. There's a fatal encounter. It doesn't move. The other group's trust is going along like this. It goes down, but it does not quite get that low. And then it comes back up. You're right. So yes, that's an excellent question. I should probably have a way to graphically show that more concisely.
I was just looking this stuff up on my phone while you were talking. So interestingly, in 2020, the trust in the police among Black Americans dropped significantly and then rebounds somewhat in 2021. The trust among white Americans drops less, doesn't come back up, but doesn't drop very much. And yet, it's also the case that among Democrats, the support for the most drastic anti-police policies was disproportionately among white Democrats.
Yeah.
Makes sense of that.
Yes, I agree. We need someone who's truly a public opinion researcher, which isn't me, unfortunately, to sort out some of these bigger dynamics.
Well, if there are no questions, more questions?
I've just got an observation there.
Yeah.
If the numbers you gave us, I think the math is correct, 6/10 of our working population are in the police force. How does that compare to other Western developed countries?
I don't know off the top of my head. Percentage of the labor force.
I'm only using your numbers.
Yeah, percentage of the labor force. I mean, again, those are back of the napkin
They're close.
calculations. I don't know off the top of my head if we probably, I mean, we could find out by looking probably at OECD data for other countries. As a general matter, of course, the United States has much higher crime than most other OECD countries. And the United States is, famously or infamously much more punitive, meaning the number of people incarcerated per 100,000 in the United States is, I think, like 609, whereas like most of the rest of the OECD countries, it's like 10 people per 100,000. So it wouldn't surprise me if we did have greater law enforcement employment than some of the other, European democracies. But I don't know the numbers off the top of my head.
Well, please join me in thanking Professor Disalvo.